A reader can enjoy Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings without caring about or knowing anything about the larger literary background that Tolkien is inheriting and appreciating in his work. But I think it does add a level of appreciation to look at other literary works that seem to have been activated in Tolkien's imagination when he wrote The Lord of the Rings. I want to look at two authors, at Shakespeare and at Richard Wagner, and think some about how Tolkien's storytelling picks up and transforms, and indeed transfigures, aspect of the great storytelling that Shakespeare and Wagner themselves were able to do. Now, Tolkien famously said about Shakespeare that he had a cheerful dislike of Shakespeare's representation of elves, and he equally famous gave a much more curt and less cheerful dismissal of any relationship he might have to Wagner in response to a question about the relationship between his story of the Ring and Wagner's story of the Ring in his great four-opera sequence, The Ring of the Nibelung. Tolkien is quoted as responding to that inquiry by saying that both the rings are round and at that point the similarity ends. Well, I think Tolkien was protesting too much about that, and in fact there are some very deep points of contact between his own telling of the story of the Ring and Wagner's. Now, Tolkien obviously was a world expert, in fact perhaps the greatest expert the world has ever produced, on how to inherit the mythology of Northern Europe, the great Norse myths particularly. I'm not going to focus on that literary inheritance, as interesting as it is. In some ways, I'm more interested in, you might say, Tolkien as a modern man, as a man who's inheriting a literary and aesthetic culture of his own place and time, reaching back into the 19th century. So, I want to focus on a few ways in which I see Shakespeare and Wagner being activated in Tolkien's own imagination. This doesn't mean that he's dependent on Shakespeare or Wagner. It means rather that he appropriates and makes alive things that he finds in Shakespeare and in Wagner. Often enough, he appropriates and makes those things alive by moving the center of gravity of something in Shakespeare or in Wagner, making it his own. You could even see Tolkien's storytelling as taking up elements from Shakespeare and Wagner and not exactly criticizing, but you might say improving upon what Shakespeare and Wagner did with those raw materials, those story elements. So at least will be the way I'm trying to think my way down into the presence of Shakespeare and of Wagner within the imaginary world of The Lord of the Rings. Let me start with Tolkien's own cheerful dislike of the picture of elves in Shakespeare. He had in mind particularly Shakespeare's great comedy, A Midsummer Night's Dream. Part of what Tolkien disliked about the elves in A Midsummer Night's Dream is that they're these teeny tiny little figures who perform services and flatter Nick Bottom when he's been transformed into an ass. Now, it's true that some of the elves are presented as these little figures, these kind of nature toys. And you can see why Tolkien, who wanted to bring out something of great dignity and indeed tragedy in the elves' story, would not want us to be imagining the elves in such a trivial way. But in this respect, as in others, Tolkien sometimes protests too much about his difference from the presentation of the elves in Shakespeare's comedy. Let me say a little bit more about that. So, the elves, that is, the fairies in A Midsummer Night's Dream, are not limited to the subordinate little fairies like Mustard Seed, they all have little names like that, who take care of Nick Bottom when he's been transfigured. the most important of the fairies are the king and queen of the fairies, Oberon and Titania, along with Puck, that is, with Robin Goodfellow, the fairy who's the servant to the king Oberon, and who performs a variety of playful transformations on the human lovers who are at the core of the tragedy of Midsummer Night's Dream. Now, it's not to my purpose to give a full interpretation of A Midsummer Night's Dream, tempting as that is. It's such a beautiful play. I'm only pointing to some points of contact with Tolkien here. The two main features of the fairies in A Midsummer Night's Dream are really their playfulness that amounts to their teasing relationship to human beings. Things that humans take terribly seriously, like who loves me, for them, for the elves, for the fairies, are a matter of mere playfulness. And so they make fun of the human beings for falling in love, for being fools. And they manipulate them and enjoy watching all the crazy things that happen to human beings. In this respect, Shakespeare is a part of a tradition about fairies and about what happens to a human being who falls into the fairy world that Tolkien himself makes central to his understanding about fairies, that is, about the elves. The notion that when we enter the fairy realm, we enter a magical realm of transformations and transfigurations that we cannot control. That notion is absolutely central to Shakespeare, but it's absolutely central to Tolkien. This is why figures like the men Boromir and Éomer and Faramir all think that entering the fairy world is so perilous and so dangerous. But it's also why in lots of interactions in Lord of the Rings between the elves and hobbits or humans, the elves tease the hobbits or humans who they're with. This goes all the way back to the very first meeting with the elves. You'll remember that as Frodo and Sam are hiking through the Shire, a black rider appears but is frightened away by the appearance of a troop of elves. That troop of elves happens to be singing a hymn to one of their primary goddesses, Elbereth, who's the goddess who's the star kindler. It's obvious that Tolkien's imagination is here deeply informed by certain images of the Virgin Mary as well. That's another interesting theme about the way that Tolkien figures the elves, and especially the powerful female figures in the elven world. But when Frodo and Sam take up with this troop of elves and stay overnight with them and have a banquet, one of the things that happens is that the elves tease them. So the elves are very playful. They talk about how difficult it is to tell one human being from another for them, and about particularly how boring it is to talk to human beings. Now, one would not usually think of this as a model of hospitality. If you come across somebody and invite that person to have dinner with you, and then start talking about how people like that are boring to talk to, somebody might think your invitation wasn't wholly sincere. But of course, the tone of the elves is teasing and playful. So there's a bit of truth, though, in that teasing. Part of the way that elves' wit works is that they have a bit of a needle that they poke you with. So you know that there is something true about the notion that elves don't think humans are nearly as interesting as they are, let alone hobbits, who are more boring even than most human beings. So, A Midsummer Night's Dream's picture of the elves is really not that far from a lot of the picture that's also in The Lord of the Rings. If you only focus on the little elves, Mustard Seed and his cohorts, who take care of Bottom, then Tolkien's objection that, oh, they're diminished, they're just made comic, it doesn't capture their dignity and their tragedy, then you can understand that. But if instead you focus on the big fairies, on Oberon and Titania, and on Robin Goodfellow, on Puck, now you see how close that dangerous fairy world, full of power but seeming to lack seriousness, at least from a human point of view. When you see A Midsummer Night's Dream in that light, all of a sudden thematic parallels to The Lord of the Rings pop out and become available to you. I would even go this far. The key figure in A Midsummer Night's Dream is a member of the common people, Nick Bottom, who, when he goes into the fairy world, goes through a transfiguration, and by a complicated story about magic potions, is transformed and given an ass head. It's one of the funniest things in the play. And Nick Bottom represents a common man. He is not an aristocrat, he's not learned, but he throws himself into the experience of the fairy world. He loves being transformed. And in fact, the Queen of the Fairies, Titania, falls in love with him. This is Shakespeare's version of, let's say, the happiest possibility of an ordinary good person falling into the realm of the fairies and the elves, being transfigured, but coming out of it not unscathed and changed. This is the language that Bottom uses of himself, about his experience in the fairy world. In other words, Shakespeare has already established the template for how a common man can enter the fairy world, be transformed, and come out of it as a better, richer person. In other words, Shakespeare, in A Midsummer Night's Dream, has established the very template of what goes on with Frodo, and especially with Sam, when they enter the fairy world of Lothlorien, and when Sam, in effect, falls in love with the queen of the fairy realm, with Galadriel. So, Shakespeare may have said that he cheerfully disliked the picture of the elves in A Midsummer Night's Dream, but yet he learned an awful lot from it. And in some ways, his picture of the teasingness, the dangerousness, the perilousness of the elves, the way that they're a realm of transfiguration, but yet a realm that can, in the changes it works upon a human being, have a positive effect. All of those thematic elements are present in a really potent way within Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. In general, never trust an author who expresses a dislike for some aspect of a work. Often that particular work, like A Midsummer Night's Dream, has been much more activated in the author's imagination than the critical comment might let on. Another feature of Shakespeare that Tolkien also acknowledged as important to him, it comes from Macbeth. In Macbeth, Macbeth has received a prophecy that he cannot be defeated until the forest comes to his castle. And this fills Macbeth with great confidence that even when things look bad, he's not worried that he can be attacked successfully. His enemies, as they approach, are hidden in the wood and decide to camouflage their approach to his castle by cutting off boughs from the trees, and as they advance on the castle, holding those boughs in front of them so they're covered up by the branches. And that counts then as fulfilling the prophecy that the wood would come to Macbeth's castle. Now, Tolkien thought that was a very cheap way for that prophecy to be fulfilled. And so he wanted to find a way of writing a scene that also involves trees going to a castle for a crucial battle, but that didn't turn the trees into just dead branches. And so the Battle of Helm's Deep involves, as well as the destruction of Saruman's realm at Isengard, involves real trees, both with the Ents and with the Huorns, moving from their forest first to Saruman's realm, Saruman's castle, and then from there down to the fort, the castle, at Helm's Deep, and playing a crucial role in defeating Saruman's army of men and orcs in both of those places. So, Tolkien animated the trees in a way that Shakespeare had not. Shakespeare also had that forest be part of the instrument of the forces of good, defeating the forces of evil, and particularly of the use of the forest as overcoming the false confidence of the forces of evil, that is, of Macbeth. Those aspects Tolkien kept from Macbeth. But what's the difference between having the prophecy that the forest has to come against the evildoer before the evildoer will be destroyed? What's the difference between having dead branches and live living trees? This goes into a much deeper stratum of Tolkien's own imagination. Tolkien wanted the natural world, emblematized here by trees, to be able, so to speak, to speak for itself, to be its own agent. It's not just that it's sort of cheap that tree branches from a forest counted as a forest in Macbeth. It's that the trees were turned into nothing but the dead instruments, the tools to be used by the good guys who are advancing against Macbeth. How much more satisfying, morally satisfying is it if in fact the agency of the trees, of the forest itself, is what comes along with the military force of the good guys to defeat the evil? In Shakespeare's use of this in Macbeth, the trees, the natural world, is just another instrument, another tool of the human beings. In Tolkien, the natural world is, so to speak, respected in its own autonomy, its own agency. And that autonomy and that respect then produce a much more moving sense of the way that the human forces of good coordinate with, are congenial to, the natural world. The natural world's not reduced merely to our tool anymore. So it's not just that Tolkien wanted to tell a story where the fulfillment of a prophecy didn't depend on what looks like just a trick, almost just a joke. Yeah, so you brought a tree branch, that counts as the forest attacking me. Rather, Tolkien wanted to think his way into a much richer relationship between goodness and nature. A relationship that depends on a kind of respect for nature, a respect for nature as, you might say, an independent source of value, independent, that is, from human beings and human purposes. This issue of the independence of nature and natural value is made exemplary in the figure of the leader of the Ents, of Treebeard. Treebeard famously says to the two hobbits, Merry and Pippin, when they ask Treebeard, whose side are you on? That is, to them there are two sides. There's Sauron and there's everybody opposed to the Dark Lord. And Treebeard's answer must have surprised them and made their world much larger than it had been before. Because what Treebeard said is, I'm not really on a side because nobody's really on our side, on the side of nature. It turns out that as an independent source of value that should be respected and acknowledged, the trees and the ents that Treebeard represents, they're really not focused on either by the good guys or the bad guys. There is a world of power politics, call it, that the good guys and the bad guys are struggling in. But when you're inside of that power struggle, it's as if all the rest of the world and all of its values are eclipsed for you. All you can see is the intensity of the power struggle. In the middle of a war, who can write a novel? Now, some people do write novels in the middle of the war, but if you don't write a novel about the war, you might well be criticized by people as not being socially conscious enough, for example. But the world goes on outside of power politics. And so I think that Tolkien's response to Macbeth is not just a response to something that seems a cheap trick. I think it goes much deeper. It's part of Tolkien's more general reflection on how the sources of value within nature are to be respected outside of the narrowing framework that the urgencies of power politics, and particularly of war, make impinge on the way we usually think. In a time of war, everything that's not about the war tends to get lost. And that is as true about the good guys in a war as it is about the bad guys. So, Tolkien's relationship to Macbeth goes pretty deep down into the storytelling he wants to tell in the novel. You might, from that point of view, understand better why in the 1960s Tolkien was a cult author for people associated with the growing environmentalist movement. You might say that Tolkien was the first great Catholic mind who got to the place that Pope Francis got to in his encyclical on the environment and on the ways that we should respect it and value it as a part of the goodness of creation, not just as an instrument to human purposes, whether human purpose is good or bad. Now, one other aspect of Shakespeare that I want to turn to, this one I think would be more controversial with many fans of Tolkien. I would say that the notion that Tolkien takes over from a literary tradition about the elves and the fairies, including Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, certain aspects of the elves in their inability to take fully seriously merely human problems. I think that most readers of Tolkien would accept that. They might be surprised to think about how much of that's already present in A Midsummer Night's Dream, but I don't think they would find any challenge to their picture of Tolkien's own mind, his own thoughtfulness and imagination, in my emphasizing that connection. Similarly, I don't think many people would object to seeing a richer relationship to Macbeth than merely saying that it's a trick to have the boughs of trees count as a forest, and to see that as part of the much deeper stratum in Tolkien's storytelling about the autonomy of nature and its autonomous value. The third connection that I would like to draw, though, I think would be more controversial. Let me start with a passage from Shakespeare. In Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, there is a very focused exploration of the nature of erotic love and erotic attraction, and how erotic attraction exercises power over us. So, roughly speaking, there's a contrast between Rome and its very austere political power and Egypt and its very erotic kinds of power. And Cleopatra's beauty and fascination for strong Roman men like Mark Antony, is Shakespeare's way of exploring the multiple sources of power and the way that a more austere power, like the Roman power, can see the more erotic and aesthetic power that depends on beauty and theatricality only as a threat to itself. It can't integrate that power into itself. So that it's as if Mark Antony can be in love with Cleopatra only if he stops being a Roman. What a terrible place to be stuck between being a political leader and being a lover. Is there no way to integrate those two things? So, Shakespeare's play is doing a lot of work on these kinds of contrasts, setting them up as a contrast between Rome and Egypt, roughly speaking. So, Cleopatra is reported to have made her entrance into Mark Antony's world on a fancy boat in which she presents herself theatrically as the goddess Venus. Mark Antony's loyal lieutenant, Enobarbus, reports this in a speech that in performance, you've got to make a decision. If you're the director, how do you want the actor playing Enobarbus to deliver this speech? The way I hear this speech, I don't promise when I read it I'll deliver it this way. The way I hear this speech, Enobarbus gives this speech with a smiling admiration for what a great actress Cleopatra is, and at the same time with a kind of ironic critique of his master, of Mark Antony, for falling for her act. So, here's Enobarbus's description of Cleopatra entering on her Venus-like boat. The barge she sat in, like a burnished throne, burned on the water. The poop was beaten gold, purple the sails, and so perfumed that the winds were lovesick with them. She actually perfumed the sails of the boat so that the breeze that was blowing her towards shore also was perfumed. So Mark Antony's on the shore, and here's this extraordinary thing sailing toward him. The perfume reaches him, of course, before the boat ever does. So she's done everything to get the right mood. The visuals of the gold and the purple, but even the sense of smell has been excited by Cleopatra with her perfumes. The winds were lovesick with the perfumes, he says. The oars were silver, which to the tune of flutes kept stroke, and made the water which they beat to follow faster. So physically, the ship, of course, as you move the oars, you see the wake that looks like it's following the ship. Enobarbus sees that as an image of Cleopatra's erotic powers. The very oars that are moving her make the water want to follow her. She captures everything within this theater of eros that she produces. The oars made the water which they beat to follow faster, as amorous of their strokes, as if the very strokes were the things that made them fall in love. So that Cleopatra's erotic power goes along with people wanting to submit themselves to what you might think were her tortures. But yet, her talent for bickering with Mark Antony is exactly what keeps him so attracted to her. For her own person, Enobarbus goes on, it beggared all description. She did lie in her pavilion, cloth of gold of tissue, over picturing that Venus where we see the fancy outwork nature. That is to say, as she reclined in her pavilion of gold, she made an even greater picture of the goddess of love than a painting would of Venus, that painted Venus as more beautiful to the fancy than any human woman could ever be in real life. And then he goes on to say, on each side her stood pretty dimpled boys, like smiling cupids. And here you can hear Enobarbus just shaking his head. I mean, in a way, what a great theatrical moment that she got two boys who looked like cupids. But on the other hand, how silly. But all love seems silly when viewed from the outside, from a third person point of view, even though it feels so powerful from a first person point of view, when you're the person feeling the attraction. The pretty dimpled boys like smiling cupids, with diverse colored fans, whose wind did seem to glow the delicate cheeks which they did cool. And what they undid, did. That is, these two cupids have these big fans, and they're fanning Cleopatra, lounging there, dressed up like Venus, in her pavilion of gold cloth. And as they fan her to cool her, it seems to make her cheeks glow, as if in the very act of cooling her, they heat her up. They make her hot, to use the contemporary idiom, which was also part of Shakespeare's idiom. So Cleopatra has staged her appearance before Antony as the goddess of erotic passion, as Venus, and all of the physical things that make the boat go, and all of the attendants, all of these things are turned into a theater of erotic desire, of erotic passion. It's an extraordinary moment about the way that theater can make a human woman become a goddess to us. Think about Cleopatra's barge, then, in light of the following passage. As the travelers are preparing to leave Lothlorien, they're going to travel on the river in boats, and so that's where they are. And here is how Galadriel appears to them for the final feast they'll have before they go on their way. They turned a sharp bend in the river, and there, sailing proudly down the stream towards them, they saw a swan of great size. The water rippled on either side of the white breast beneath its curving neck. Its beak shone like burnished gold. Remember the word burnished from Shakespeare's passage in the description of the barge of Cleopatra. Its beak shone like burnished gold, and its eyes glinted like jet set in yellow stones. Its huge white wings were half lifted. A music came down the river. Remember those flutes playing for Cleopatra's barge? A music came down the river as it drew nearer, and suddenly they perceived that it was a ship, wrought and carved with elven skill in the likeness of a bird. It had looked like a swan, but in fact, it's Galadriel's barge. Two elves, clad in white, steered it with black paddles, just like those dimpled boys who looked like cupids on Cleopatra's barge. In the midst of the vessel sat Celeborn, and behind him stood Galadriel, tall and white. A circlet of golden flowers was in her hair, and in her hand she held a harp, and she sang. Sad and sweet was the sound of her voice in the cool, clear air. I find it impossible not to hear Tolkien rewriting Cleopatra's barge in Galadriel's swan ship. In Shakespeare, Cleopatra's barge is an emblem of if not the corrupted, at least the disturbing and turbulent power of erotic passion and attraction within a world dominated by politics. Tolkien takes that power and purifies it and uplifts it into the power that Galadriel's beauty exercises over Frodo and Sam and all the other members of the Travelers, particularly of Gimli. It's Gimli who most directly falls in love with Galadriel. So, Galadriel's swan boat is theatrical in every bit the extent that Cleopatra's Venus barge is. But the theater is now used to uplift mere sensuous or erotic desire into a larger appreciation of the transcendent value that Galadriel embodies and represents. In Shakespeare, this was true too. Venus is a goddess. Cleopatra used theater to elevate herself, and therefore the experience that Mark Antony has of her beauty, into something divine, something that points toward a goddess. But yet that goddess herself has within her the makings for turbulent anxiety about her power. Venus is an essentially questionable, or at least perilous, goddess. The Lady Galadriel, Tolkien makes it, inherits this power that was in Cleopatra's barge, but now uplifts it. And so the goddess figure, the divine female figure that Galadriel brings to our mind is probably less Venus than it is the Virgin Mary, as many readers have thought. But I don't want to leave it at something quite that simple. It's not as if, by imitating this passage from Shakespeare, Tolkien then just cleanses Eros of all of its difficulties. Far from it. He reveals the positive side of Eros more centrally. That's the side of it that's most prominent in Tolkien's rewriting of Shakespeare, whereas it's the more dangerous or perilous side that's more prominent in Shakespeare's original. But Tolkien does not let you forget the dangerous side. There is something still true about the perilousness of the beauty that Galadriel represents. I think this is a wonderful example of something that Tolkien does in many places. Tolkien gives us the positive interpretation of something as its most prominent interpretation, but at the same time he allows the observant reader to chasten your unfettered enthusiasm for a power by seeing that there can be a dark or corrupted version of the very same thing. Galadriel and Cleopatra have too much in common for me to think that Tolkien didn't notice. In case you haven't yet been convinced, let me mention one other thing. Cleopatra, of course, is presented to us as imitating Venus, as being close to Venus. You might remember that in the scene when Galadriel is transfigured before Frodo and Sam, toward the end of the chapter, The Mirror of Galadriel, when she raises her ring and a star shines through it. That star is the evening star, which is to say, Venus. The connection between Galadriel and the Virgin Mary is very prominent and very real. But the connection between Galadriel and the pagan goddess Venus is also available to the careful reader whose imagination is open to some of the complexity of Tolkien's own thoughts about the balance between the positive and the negative power. This leads me to one last point of connection I would like to make, this time not with Shakespeare, but with Richard Wagner's Ring of the Nibelung. I do not take seriously Tolkien's comment about how there's nothing in common between his ring and Wagner's ring. Indeed, I think that one can go through the connections between Wagner's ring and Tolkien's ring and see very systematically that Tolkien is doing with Wagner something like what I've just said he's doing with this passage from Shakespeare. He's taking something that in Wagner celebrates, revels in a moral ambiguity, an ambiguous situation, as if Wagner wants us to experience the ambiguity. Tolkien takes over that ambiguity and shows us a way up, and perhaps a way out, to some extent, of that ambiguity. I'll just take one example here. One could take lots of examples from the female figures and issues about sexuality, but I want to focus instead on a question about power. The figure of Wotan, the leader of the gods in Wagner's Ring, is the figure of a man who feels his great power still leaves him unfree. It's almost impossible to summarize Wagner's story about this ring of power, but I'll only say this much about it. Wotan would like the ring of power to be destroyed because he's afraid its power can be used against him. But Wotan is not in a position to destroy it himself. The contracts that he's made have made it impossible for him to be the one who does the destruction. So Wotan is looking for a way to get somebody else to do it. The problem is that when you're a big, powerful god, or let's say you're running a country, or for that matter, a company, and there's something you would like to have happen, but you're not in a position, you can't be the person to do it, right? You need plausible deniability. You need somebody else to take responsibility for doing it. The problem is if you just happen to say to some of the people who are your agents, who work for you, boy, I really wish that that would happen, and then one of them runs off and does it, everybody will just blame you. They'll think you did it. That's the position Wotan is in. I really wish somebody would get rid of that ring, but Wotan produces people to try to do that, particularly a figure named Sigmund, but everybody says, well, wait a second, that's just you. You're just using him as a tool or a puppet. So the drama for Wotan is, how can there be a completely free agent who yet does the thing that I need to get done? And that turns out to be Siegfried. But because Siegfried is a completely free agent, even though he does what Wotan wants in one sense, it turns out that the thing he does also destroys Wotan. So part of Wagner's whole story is a story about a paradox about power. That power sometimes seems to constrain us so that what we would want to have happen is something we have to just hope somebody else does. They have to do it as a free agent. But if we really leave them free, what they do might not really answer to what we would like to have happen. The way this comes up in The Lord of the Rings is through a whole series of passages about how leaders use other people as tools. This starts out in a confrontation between Gandalf and Denethor, who's the steward, the lord of Gondor, of Minas Tirith. And Gandalf is rather irritated that Denethor has used a bunch of time questioning the hobbit Pippin rather than talking directly to Gandalf. And Denethor says to Gandalf, "Pride would be folly that disdained help and counsel at need, but you deal out such gifts according to your own designs." That is, Denethor notes the same thing about Gandalf that all the characters note, that he's very close to the vest. And you never know how much he's telling you of what he really knows. Well, Denethor thinks, look, I'm the steward of Gondor. I can't be fooling around trying to figure out how much you're really telling me. And he goes on to say, the Lord of Gondor is not to be made the tool of other men's purposes, however worthy. So, Denethor feels like Gandalf is trying to use him for something. And so he thinks his responsibility as the steward means that he can't let himself be the tool of anybody else. Partly, he doesn't like somebody else bossing him around, but partly because it's his job to care about Gondor. Gandalf responds in a passage that I think every reader of The Lord of the Rings cheers for Gandalf. It's like you think, yes, that Gandalf, he's a great guy. Gandalf says, the rule of no realm is mine, neither of Gondor nor any other great or small, but all worthy things that are in peril as the world now stands, those are my care. And for my part I shall not wholly fail of my task, though Gondor should perish, if anything passes through this night that can still grow fair and bear fruit and flower again in days to come. We take the side of Gandalf. Why don't we take the side of Denethor? Was Denethor wrong to think that this makes it sound like he might be turned into a tool? That word tool, that is a word you should circle and look for it in other places. Later on, after the battle's going very poorly and Denethor is starting to despair, Gandalf says this. Pippin is with Gandalf and Denethor at this point. Gandalf says, one has come that I feared. And Pippin says, not the Dark Lord, right? It's not Sauron himself, is it? And Denethor laughed bitterly. Nay, not yet, Master Peregrine. He will not come, save only to triumph over me when all is won. He uses others as his weapons. So do all great lords, if they are wise, Master Halfling. And Denethor implies that he himself does the same thing. He uses other people as his weapons or as his tools. So now, using somebody else as your tool, first Denethor accused Gandalf of wanting to do it. Now Denethor says, all great lords do it. I do it, and Sauron does it. Well, a bit later, when Denethor has reached the point of a suicidal despair, here's what he says on the point of suicide. He says this to Gandalf. Do I not know thee, Gandalf? Thy hope is to rule in my stead, to stand behind every throne. I have read thy mind and its policies. He says, in our speech together I have learned the names and purposes of all thy companions. So, with the left hand thou wouldst use me for a little while as a shield against Mordor, and with the right bring up this ranger of the north to supplant me, Aragorn, the true king. But I say to thee, Gandalf, I will not be thy tool. So, Denethor sees Gandalf bringing Aragorn to assume the kingship of Gondor as being used. Denethor sees himself being used to let that happen. And who could say that he's wholly wrong? We might be on Gandalf's side, but it's not as if Denethor is saying something that's merely crazy or false. Tolkien has given you these passages about how great lords use others as weapons or tools in order to make you less comfortable with thinking that it's easy to be Gandalf, or it's easy to see that Gandalf's got all the right on his own side. There might be reasons that people like Denethor oppose Gandalf. Now, Tolkien makes Denethor an unsympathetic character. You don't like him. He's like an old spider. But that's an author's trick. By making a character who speaks a hard truth an unsympathetic character, Tolkien lets the lazy reader pass over the core of truth that Denethor has stated here. Finally, if that weren't enough, in The Scouring of the Shire, so now toward the end of the novel, we meet Saruman back in the Shire doing terrible things there. And he says that you thought that that Saruman's home could be all wrecked and he could be turned out, but no one could touch yours. Oh no, you thought Gandalf would look after your affairs. And Saruman laughs and says, not he, not Gandalf. When his tools have done their task, he drops them. Did Gandalf use Frodo as a tool? Gandalf seems to have found a free agent in the way that Wotan found Siegfried as a free agent, to do the very thing he could not do himself, because Gandalf could not accept the ring and go do the work that was necessary. Frodo, after all, offered it to him. The structural similarities between Wotan looking for a free agent to carry out the task he can't do himself, and Gandalf sponsoring a free agent, Frodo, to do a task he can't do himself. Those structural connections are too close for comfort. But then, what makes you think The Lord of the Rings should make you comfortable? One more example of how Tolkien meant to leave you less comfortable, less sure of yourself when you take the side of the good guys. This is from the very beginning of the novel, and it's easy not even to notice it. So in The Shadow of the Past, Gandalf is talking to Frodo back in the Shire before any of this adventure starts, and telling him the history of the ring. And he says he found Gollum and questioned him about it. Here's what Gandalf says. I endured him as long as I could, but the truth was desperately important, and in the end I had to be harsh. I put the fear of fire on him and wrung the true story out of him, bit by bit, together with much sniveling and snarling. Gollum thought he was misunderstood and ill-used. Barely a page later, we have this passage. Where had Gollum been before Gandalf found him? What had he been doing he would not say. He only wept and called us cruel, with many a Gollum in his throat. And when we pressed him, he whined and cringed, and rubbing his long hands, licking his fingers as if they pained him, as if he remembered some old torture. But I'm afraid there is no possible doubt. He had made his way to the land of Mordor. That is, Gollum was tortured at Mordor. What was he when he was with Gandalf? I put the fear of fire on him and wrung the true story out of him. Why do you suppose Gollum might have called Gandalf cruel? Would you feel better if instead of using fire to wring the truth out of Gollum, he had, say, used water? He might have waterboarded him. These questions never go away about torture and who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. But after all, as Tolkien lets us see, the truth was desperately, desperately important. So are the words of Gandalf. So are the words of every torturer. Tolkien realized, I think, how hard it is to separate the good from the bad in this changeable world without any remainder. As readers, he invites us to identify with the goodness of the good guys. But he also gives us the opportunity, if we choose to take it, of seeing the kernel of truth in those who have a darker view of the nature of the world.